A sudden crash of shattering glass choked the life out of the room, leaving behind a dead silence. New York's most toxic Mafia princess, Isabella Russo, had just deliberately emptied $1,000 bottle of wine over a waitress. The onlookers braced themselves for the girl to flee in tears, but she didn't budge. Holding her ground, she stared directly into the eyes of the city's most ruthless crime boss and let out a knowing smile. There is an unspoken rule at the Obsidian Room, Manhattan's most exclusive and heavily guarded subterranean lounge. You do not look the VIPs in the eye, and you never, ever speak unless spoken to. It was a playground for the city's elite, which in New York meant it was a playground for the families who truly ran the streets. Mia Henderson knew these rules better than anyone. At 24, she was an anomaly in a sea of waitstaff who looked like they had just walked off the runway of a Victoria's Secret fashion show. Mia was fat. Not curvy in the sanitized, socially acceptable way the magazines tried to package it, but undeniably, softly, and beautifully fat. She had thick thighs, a round stomach, and a soft, full face framed by a halo of dark, curly hair. In a superficial world of sharp angles and starved bodies, Mia took up space, and she refused to apologize for it. Her manager, a nervous, sweating man named Edward Pendleton, usually kept her in the less conspicuous areas of the lounge. Not because she wasn't good at her job. Mia was the most efficient, observant server they had, but because he was terrified of offending the delicate sensibilities of the billionaires and mobsters who wanted eye candy with their scotch. But tonight was different. Tonight, the Russos were in the house. The Russo syndicate controlled the docks, the unions, and half the politicians in the state. At the head of the table sat Dominic Russo. At 32, Dominic was a terrifying force of nature. He wasn't loud or brash like the old-school mobsters. He was perfectly tailored, eerily quiet, and possessed a gaze so sharp it felt like a physical weight pressing down on you. Beside him sat his right-hand man, Leo Rossi, and across from him was the true terror of the evening, his younger sister, Isabella. Isabella Russo was 21, breathtakingly beautiful, and possessed a soul as ugly as a festering wound. Pampered, entitled, and fiercely protected by her brother's reputation, she treated the world like her personal ashtray. And tonight, she was in a violently foul mood. Rumor in the back room was that her fiancé, a low-level captain in a rival family, had been caught sleeping with his secretary. Isabella wasn't just angry. She was looking for a target to humiliate so she could feel powerful again. "Edward, I'm not going back to table 1, whispered Savannah, a blonde waitress, bursting into the service hallway with tears streaming down her face. She just threw an olive at my head and told me I looked like a diseased rat. I can't do it." Edward wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, looking completely frantic. "I can't send anyone else out there. She's chewed through 3 girls in an hour. Dominic hasn't said a word. He just watches. If we don't get them their next round, they'll burn this place to the ground." Mia, who was calmly polishing a stack of highball glasses, sighed. She set her towel down and picked up the silver tray, loaded with Isabella's notoriously complex order. A bone-dry martini with exactly 3 hand-stuffed blue cheese olives and Dominic's neat pour of Macallan 25. "I'll take it," Mia said, her voice smooth and grounded. Edward looked at her, his eyes widening in panic. He looked her up and down, taking in her size 18 uniform that stretched comfortably over her hips. "Mia, no. Isabella she's vicious. She'll tear you apart." You don't fit the, you know. I know I'm fat, Edward. It's not a secret, Mia said dryly. But I also don't cry when entitled brats throw tantrums. Let me handle it before she gets bored and decides to have Leo break your kneecaps. Edward swallowed hard, stepping aside. Mia pushed through the heavy velvet curtains and stepped into the dim, amber-lit main floor. The heavy bass of the jazz trio thumped against her chest, but her heartbeat remained steady. She navigated the crowded floor with surprising grace, her movements fluid and practiced. As she approached table 1, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. 2 massive bodyguards flanked the booth, but they parted slightly as Mia approached with the tray. Isabella was in the middle of a rant, her manicured nails tapping furiously against the mahogany table. And I told him if he ever looks at a girl like that again, I'll have his eyes spooned out. Right, Dom? Dominic didn't answer. He was staring straight ahead, looking profoundly bored. That is, until Mia stopped at the edge of the table. Good evening. Your drinks, Mia said, her tone perfectly neutral. She stepped forward to serve Dominic first, placing the crystal glass of amber liquid onto a fresh coaster with absolute precision. Dominic's dark eyes flicked up, locking onto her. He paused. He was used to waitresses who trembled, who over-smiled, who tried too hard to flirt or were paralyzed by fear. Mia did none of those things. She met his gaze for a fraction of a second, just enough to acknowledge him, before pivoting smoothly to Isabella. Isabella stopped mid-sentence. She looked at Mia, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows pulling together in immediate, visceral disgust. She looked Mia up and down, her eyes lingering cruelly on Mia's thick waist and the fullness of her arms. The viper had found her prey. "Excuse me," Isabella drawled, her voice carrying over the music. The surrounding tables, populated by lower-ranking made men and terrified socialites, instinctively quieted down. Everyone loved a blood sport, as long as they weren't in the ring. What exactly are you supposed to be? Mia didn't flinch. She kept her posture straight, holding the silver tray by her side. I am your server for the rest of the evening, Miss Russo. Is there anything else I can get for you? Isabella let out a harsh, barking laugh. She turned to Leo, who shifted uncomfortably. Leo, did the club run out of uniforms, or did this one just eat the last 3 girls who worked here? A few sycophants at the neighboring tables let out nervous, forced chuckles. Edward, watching from the curtained doorway, looked like he was about to faint. Dominic remained entirely silent. He slowly took a sip of his scotch, his eyes never leaving Mia's face. He was waiting. Mia took a slow, deep breath. She had heard the fat jokes 1,000,000 times. She had been mocked in high school, dismissed in job interviews, and overlooked in bars. But she had spent years building an armor of self-love that a spoiled mobster's sister couldn't pierce with a cheap insult. The uniforms are custom-tailored, Miss Russo, Mia replied evenly, her voice devoid of the shame Isabella was desperately trying to mine. If the martini isn't to your liking, I can have the bartender remake it. Isabella's eyes flashed with real fury. She hated being ignored, but she absolutely despised being deprived of a reaction. The fact that this plus-size nobody wasn't shrinking into a puddle of tears infuriated her. I don't want a new drink, Isabella snapped, standing up suddenly. I want to know why a place that charges a $10,000 cover fee is subjecting my eyes to a beached whale. The room went dead silent. The jazz band faltered, missing a beat before nervously continuing. Isabella picked up her full martini glass. With a sneer, she tipped it forward, intentionally pouring the icy liquid and the blue cheese olives directly down the front of Mia's black uniform. The alcohol soaked through her shirt instantly, cold and stinging against her skin. Finally, Isabella dropped the crystal glass onto the floor, where it shattered into a dozen glittering pieces. "Oops," Isabella whispered, her lips curling into a wicked smile. "Looks like you need to go clean up, fatty." The silence in the lounge was deafening. Every eye was on Mia. The bodyguards tensed, ready to step in if the waitress did something stupid. Mia stood perfectly still for 3 long seconds. The cold vodka was dripping from the hem of her apron onto her sensible black shoes. She looked down at the mess, then slowly raised her eyes to look directly at Isabella. "A stain washes out, Miss Russo," Mia said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the quiet room it carried like a gunshot. "But insecurity, that takes years of therapy." Isabella gasped, her face flushing crimson. "What did you just say to me?" "I said," Mia continued, her tone dripping with a lethal, terrifying calm, "that tearing down my body won't make your fiancé stop sleeping with his secretary. It won't make you feel loved, and it certainly doesn't make you look powerful. It just makes you look tragic." A collective intake of breath sucked the oxygen out of the room. Leo's hand drifted toward the inside of his jacket. Edward literally fell to his knees behind the curtain. No one spoke to a Russo like that. It was a death sentence. Isabella was shaking with rage. She raised her hand, ready to slap Mia across the face, but before her hand could strike, a massive, unyielding grip caught her wrist midair. It was Dominic. He had moved so fast that no one had even seen him stand up. He held his sister's wrist in a vice grip, his face a terrifying mask of absolute authority. "Enough," Dominic said. His voice wasn't raised, but it vibrated with a dark, dangerous power that made Isabella freeze instantly. "Dom! She disrespected me!" Isabella shrieked, struggling against his hold. "You embarrassed yourself," Dominic corrected, his voice a low growl. "You act like a petulant child throwing a tantrum because a man didn't want you. You disgrace our family name by behaving like common trash." He released her wrist roughly, pointing a finger at the chair. "Sit down. Now." Isabella, tears of genuine humiliation springing to her eyes, sank into the booth, completely subdued. Dominic turned his imposing frame toward Mia. He was well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and radiated an intense, lethal energy. Mia felt a spike of adrenaline, preparing herself for the worst. She had insulted his blood. She knew how the Mafia worked. But when Dominic looked down at her, there was no anger in his dark eyes. There was something else. Fascination. Respect. A burning curiosity. He took in her soaked uniform, the defiant tilt of her chin, and the undeniable beauty of her soft features. He slowly reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a silk pocket square, and gently, deliberately, handed it to her. "My apologies for my sister's abysmal manners," Dominic said softly, his deep voice meant only for her ears. "You handle yourself with more grace than most men in my world, Miss Mia," she said, her voice barely a whisper, taking the silk square from his massive hand. Their fingers brushed, and a sudden, shocking jolt of electricity sparked between them. "Mia." He tasted her name, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "Go change, Mia. When you come back, you serve no one else but me." The break room of the obsidian room smelled faintly of stale coffee and panic. Edward was pacing so fast, he looked like a blur of cheap tweed, aggressively chewing on his thumbnail. "We're dead. We are legally, physically, and spiritually dead," Edward hyperventilated, watching Mia dab at the vodka stains on her black uniform with paper towels. You basically told Russo she needs psychiatric help. Do you understand what Dominic does to people who insult his family? They don't just get fired, Mia. They end up as a foundation for a new bridge in New Jersey. Mia sighed, tossing the soaked paper towels into the trash. Edward, you saw him. He didn't look like he wanted to kill me. He told me to come back out. That's how they get you, Edward squeaked. It's a psychological game. You're going out there, and Leo is going to quietly escort you to a black SUV. Mia ignored him. Her primary uniform was ruined, and the only spare they had in the back that could accommodate her chest and hips was a men's XL bartender shirt. She slipped out of her wet top, buttoned the crisp white men's shirt, and deftly tied the bottom into a knot at her waist. It hugged her curves snugly, accentuating the soft, full lines of her stomach and the flare of her hips. She didn't look like a high-fashion model, but she looked strong, grounded, and undeniably feminine. I have a table to serve, Mia said, grabbing a fresh tray and walking back through the velvet curtains. When she returned to table 1, the dynamic had violently shifted. Isabella was gone. Leo Rossi was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, effectively creating a perimeter. Dominic Russo sat alone in the curved leather booth, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. As Mia approached, his eyes dragged up her body. He didn't look at her with the clinical, dissecting gaze of a man checking off conventional beauty standards. He looked at her like he was dying of thirst, and she was the only water source in the desert. His gaze lingered on the curve of her hips and the defiant knot at her waist. "Your sister?" Mia asked, keeping her voice level as she cleared the shattered glass from the floor with a small brush and dustpan. "Sent home," Dominic replied, his deep voice rumbling over the jazz music. "I don't tolerate public tantrums, and I certainly don't tolerate cruelty directed at people who are simply doing their jobs." He gestured to the empty space on the leather banquette across from him. "Sit." Mia froze. "I'm working, Mr. Russo. Edward will have an aneurysm." "Edward works for the men who own this club," Dominic stated flatly. "And I own the men who own this club. Sit, Mia. It wasn't a request." Mia carefully set her tray down and slid into the booth opposite the most dangerous man in New York. Up close, Dominic was even more intimidating. He smelled of expensive cedar, smoke, and sheer power. "You didn't blink when Isabella threw that drink," Dominic observed, leaning forward. The dim lighting carved sharp shadows across his jawline. "You didn't cry. You didn't look for someone to save you. You analyzed her weakness, her deeply insecure attachment to Tony Costa, and you verbally disemboweled her in front of 50 people. "I don't like bullies," Mia said simply. "I've been fat my whole life, Mr. Russo. I've heard every insult imaginable before I was out of middle school. A spoiled girl with a martini doesn't scare me." Dominic's lips twitched into a genuine smile. "I believe you, but what fascinates me isn't just your spine. It's your eyes." Mia frowned, confused. "My eyes?" "When you walked up to this table the first time, before Isabella opened her mouth, you didn't look at the center of the table. You looked at my bodyguard's hands," Dominic noted. "You checked the sightlines. You noticed that Leo had his jacket unbuttoned. You read the room like a tactical operator, not a waitress." Mia felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. He had noticed. "When society decides you're invisible because you don't fit their aesthetic mold," she said quietly, "you learn to watch people. People reveal who they really are when they think no one important is looking." Dominic set his glass down. The playful intrigue in his eyes vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating look of a syndicate boss. "My sister's fiancé, Tony Costa, is an ambitious idiot, Dominic said, lowering his voice. For the last 2 months, millions of dollars have been quietly bleeding out of my shipping operations at the Red Hook terminal. My men are loyal, but someone on the inside is selling gate codes. I suspect Tony, but I cannot execute a made man without absolute proof. Tomorrow night, I am hosting a private, high-stakes poker game at the Pierre Hotel. Tony will be there, along with the key players of 3 other families. Mia stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Why are you telling me this? Because when I bring my usual girls to serve drinks, the men at the table stop talking. They posture, they get careful, Dominic explained. But you just said it yourself. Superficial men think anyone who doesn't look like a magazine cover is invisible. They will underestimate you. They will ignore you. And they will talk. Dominic reached into his jacket and slid a heavy, thick black envelope across the mahogany table. $50,000, Dominic said. Cash, tax-free. You come to the Pierre tomorrow night. You serve drinks, and you tell me exactly what you see and hear. Are you in? Mia looked at the envelope. $50,000 was life-changing. It was the end of her crushing student loans. It was her mother's medical bills paid in full. She looked up at Dominic, seeing the raw trust and dangerous invitation in his eyes. I'm going to need a better uniform, Mia said. The penthouse suite at the Pierre Hotel, overlooking Central Park, was a masterpiece of old-world opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over hand-woven Persian rugs, and the walls were lined with priceless art. In the center of the room sat a massive, custom-built felt poker table, currently occupied by 6 of the most ruthless men on the eastern seaboard. Mia stood quietly by the mahogany wet bar, a silver tray resting lightly on her fingertips. Dominic had kept his word about the uniform. That morning, a breathless tailor had arrived at Mia's tiny Brooklyn apartment with 3 garment bags. She was currently wearing a custom-tailored, deep emerald green wrap dress. The heavy silk draped flawlessly over her curves, cinching at her waist and flowing elegantly to her knees. For the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding her body. She was wearing a garment designed specifically to worship it. The atmosphere in the room was suffocatingly tense. Cigar smoke hung thick in the air. Dominic sat at the head of the table, his face an impenetrable mask, as he casually tossed $1,000 chips into the center. To his left sat Tony Costa. Tony was handsome in a sleazy, over-groomed way, wearing a flashy suit and a smug smile. He was exactly the kind of man who had mocked Mia in bars, the kind who thought a woman's only value was as a decorative accessory. Just as Dominic had predicted, the men at the table treated Mia like part of the furniture. When she approached to refill their scotch glasses, they didn't even pause their conversations. To them, the soft, thick-thighed woman silently pouring their Macallan was utterly beneath their notice. It was their fatal mistake. Over the next 2 hours, Mia moved like a ghost. She picked up fragments of conversation, subtle eye movements, and the specific rhythm of the room. She noticed how Tony Costa kept checking his heavy Rolex watch every 15 minutes. She noticed that Richie Gallagher, a corrupt union boss sitting across from Tony, had barely touched his cards, his eyes constantly darting to the door. But the real breakthrough happened at 11:45 p.m. Mia was standing behind Tony, waiting to clear an empty glass. Tony leaned over to Richie, pretending to ask for a light for his cigar. "Midnight," Tony breathed, the words so quiet they were barely a vibration in the air. "Gate 4 at Red Hook. The guards are rotated. The transport hits the docks at exactly 12:05. Richie gave a microscopic nod, lighting the cigar. And Dominic? Distracted, Tony sneered, glancing at Dominic. He thinks this game is a power play. By the time he cashes out, we'll have moved 10 million in unmarked cargo right under his nose. Mia's blood ran cold. The heist wasn't an abstract concept. It was happening right now. She needed to signal Dominic. They had established a code in the car ride over. If she heard nothing, she would serve him his usual. Macallan, 25. Neat. If she confirmed the betrayal, she was to serve it with exactly 2 ice cubes. Mia walked calmly back to the bar. Her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to take deep, steadying breaths. She grabbed a fresh crystal tumbler. She poured to the amber liquid. With a pair of silver tongs, she dropped 2 perfectly square ice cubes into the glass. The clink sounded like a death knell in her ears. She walked back to the table, her emerald dress swishing softly around her thick thighs. She approached Dominic's right side and gracefully set the glass down on his coaster. Dominic's eyes flicked down to the glass. He saw the 2 ice cubes. He didn't gasp. He didn't jump up. He simply reached out, his large fingers wrapping around the cool crystal. He looked up at Mia, and in that split second, the cold Mafia boss melted away, replaced by a man looking at her with a profound, terrifying awe. "Gentlemen," Dominic said, his voice slicing through the low murmur of the room. He slowly stood up, adjusting his cuffs. "I believe I am cashing out." Tony Costa laughed, leaning back in his chair. "Folding early, Dom? It's not even midnight." "No, Tony," Dominic said softly. He raised his hand. The heavy double doors of the penthouse burst open. A dozen of Dominic's heavily armed men flooded into the room. Before anyone could draw a weapon, the room was entirely secured. Leo Rossi stepped forward, grabbing Tony by the scruff of his expensive suit and hauling him out of his chair, slamming him face first onto the poker table. "What the hell is this?" Tony screamed, spitting blood onto the green felt. "I'm a maid, man. You can't..." Dominic walked slowly around the table, stopping right beside Tony's head. "Gate 4 at Red Hook," Dominic whispered, and Tony's struggling instantly ceased. He went totally rigid. "My men are waiting there right now. They're going to welcome your crew, Tony. And then I'm going to have a very long, very painful conversation with you about the consequences of biting the hand that feeds you." Dominic nodded at Leo. "Take him to the basement." As Tony and Richie were violently dragged from the penthouse, the remaining bosses sat in stunned silence. Dominic had just thwarted a multi-million-dollar coup without breaking a sweat. The side door to the penthouse clicked open. Isabella walked in. She had been waiting in an adjoining suite, under strict orders from Dominic to stay put until the game was over. She saw Tony being dragged away, his face bruised and panicked. "Tony!" Isabella gasped, rushing forward, but Leo blocked her path. She spun to Dominic, tears streaming down her face. "Dom, what are you doing? That's my fiancé." "Your fiancé," Dominic said coldly, "is a rat who was trying to steal $10 million from our family tonight. He was using you, Isabella. He used your status to get close to my operations, and he used his secretary because he is a hollow, pathetic man." Isabella collapsed into a nearby armchair, sobbing into her hands. The reality of her life, the betrayal, the public humiliations, the fake love, came crashing down on her. Dominic dismissed the remaining men, and within minutes the penthouse was empty save for Dominic, a crying Isabella, and Mia, who stood quietly near the bar. Isabella slowly looked up, her mascara running down her cheeks. She looked at Mia, standing tall and beautiful in the emerald dress. The same woman she had poured a drink on 24 hours ago had just saved her family's empire. Isabella stood up. She walked over to Mia, stopping a few feet away. She couldn't meet Mia's eyes entirely, the shame too heavy. I owe you, Isabella whispered, her voice cracking. I was cruel to you, because I hated myself. And you saved us. I did a job, Mia said gently, offering Isabella a clean linen napkin for her tears. But you owe it to yourself to demand better men, Isabella. Isabella took the napkin, gave a small, broken nod, and hurried out of the room. Dominic walked over to the bar. The adrenaline of the takedown was fading, leaving a quiet, heavy intimacy in the massive room. He stopped right in front of Mia, towering over her. $50,000 will be wired to your account by morning, Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave. Thank you, Mr. Russo, Mia breathed, looking up into his dark, intense eyes. Dominic, he corrected softly. He reached out, his knuckles gently brushing against the soft curve of her cheek. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who are conventionally perfect, Mia. And they are all boring, predictable, and treacherous. You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever met. His hand slid down, his broad palm resting securely on the curve of her waist, pulling her flush against his solid chest. He didn't treat her body as a fetish or a flaw. He held her like she was the most valuable thing he had ever touched. You're not going back to that lounge, Dominic murmured, his lips hovering inches from hers. You're going to stay with me, because a queen doesn't serve drinks, Mia. She rules the empire, Mia smiled, leaning up into his touch, finally stepping out of the shadows and claiming the space she had always deserved. Did Mia's bravery and Dominic's unexpected respect leave you speechless? This story proves that true power isn't about fitting into society's narrow boxes. It's about owning your space and outsmarting everyone who dares to underestimate you. If you loved this intense mafia romance full of twists, vindication, and a heroine who unapologetically embraces her curves, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their worth, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling stories.